Hello once again, everyone. So, last time we talked about Voronach, and now we're going to talk about distances. So, if you watched the conceptual footwork video, which I highly recommend you do, you would understand the idea of not passing too close to our opponent. That's where this stuff comes in. If I were to make an idealized footwork diagram, this would be overlaid of the one that we went over in that, but I will briefly explain some things that are going to be repeat information. So, first off, what are we looking at? Basically, each opponent is at either end of this circle, okay? We have a total of 4 rings. Each one has different properties and requires you to do different behaviors if you're in it. So, our first ring is out of distance. Technically, this extends just all the way out, but I put a border here just for sake of ease. So, if you're out of distance, that means you have all the time in the world to do whatever you want. You can take any stance you want, you can do a cartwheel, you don't even necessarily need to be in a guard. When are you out of distance in a fight? Well, either when you've fully withdrawn from your engagement, or usually the time you're going to be out of distance would be if you are in a sparring match, in which case we usually fight in circular rings. That'd be you standing pretty much at the edge of the ring, and if your opponent is at the opposite edge. So, that's out of distance. I have put a little note here of a rough estimate of where that's going to be for most people. About 5 passing steps, which I will go over footwork again shortly, but I have covered it on the channel before. A passing step is when your back foot goes all the way up to the front of your foot. So you switch which foot is forward while moving forward, which is generally about your normal walking pace, maybe a little larger. So 5 of those. That's out of distance. Now, moving a little closer, we get into the Zufechten. Now, I am using German terminology just because, like I said before, it's what I'm most familiar with. But Zufechten it roughly translates literally to the fight or the approach. This is where you need to be making your plan. So, if I'm out of distance, I can do whatever I want. It doesn't matter because my opponent can't reach me. No one can cover those 5 passing steps fast enough that I won't be able to react. Zufechten is when you start to now need to be on guard. You are moving into distance. Like I said, this is about 3-ish passing steps, closer to 2 or so away from a person. When you're entering into the Zufechten, you need to start being more wary of what guards you take. You need to start seeing what guards your opponent is taking, and you need to start learning behaviors. So this line here, this little border, is where you're going to be doing most of your reading of your opponent. Moving into the Zufechten with, let's say, for example, I approach up in a guard. Does my opponent jump at the chance and try to attack me? Do they shrink away from me? Do they change guards in response? Okay, I see that behavior. I'm going to pull back to at a distance. Now I am starting to form a plan. This area is where you flirt with reading your opponent, not up here. By the time you're here, there's no time to be reading the opponent anymore. It's not that you can't do it, it's that it's risky. So, moving in and out of the Zufechten, that's where you're going to be learning a lot about your opponent. Now, the next time you might go into the Zufechten is when we're actually going to approach toward the Krieg. So, I'm moving through the Zufechten, I have my plan formed, my opponent is doing the same. Now we get to the Krieg. And the Krieg is usually going to be you're taking that one passing step with your attack. The Krieg is not where you start attacking. The Krieg is where you end up as your attack brings you into it. So, Krieg, of course, means war, right? It will also sometimes be translated as fray, depending upon what translation you're reading. But the Krieg has basically one rule, and it's a very, very important rule that was told to me by a friend of mine while I was at a tournament, and it blew my freaking mind, and I did really well at that tournament, which is, if you're in the Krieg, you are either attacking, and I mean actively attacking, defending, because your opponent attacked, or you are not in the Krieg. Only 3 options. If you are close enough to be in Krieg distance and you're not doing one of those 3, you should not be there. Get away. So, the Krieg is just for the fighting. And by this point, you are in distance where the only sort of footwork you're going to be able to do, excluding the passing step that takes you into the Krieg, is going to be about one simple step. So, for example, I attack in, our swords bind, I go to wind up and thrust, my opponent is just a little bit too far away, so I'm going to use that one simple step to bring myself into distance. That's about as much as you've got. All right. Now, the last place we have is this extra little guy called the pocket. Okay, the pocket is within the Krieg, and while I made the circle smaller than the Krieg circle, it really does kind of encompass the entirety of the Krieg. But the pocket is a place you don't usually want to be. Okay, and we're going to talk about that again in a moment, because now we need to talk about time scale. Okay, so time is relative to distance in this regard. The further away I am, the more time, the larger tempo actions I can take. So what is a tempo? A tempo is a beat of time, okay? The further away, the more beats, the wider beats, the bigger beats I have. So I move into the Zufechten, it gets quicker. So I move into the Krieg, it gets even quicker. So smaller beats, smaller actions, more concise actions as I get closer. So for example, if I'm in the Krieg and I want to do a big Abnehmen, so a big cut that goes around my head and comes down the other side, if my opponent takes a smaller tempo, I'm going to lose. Because I'm trying to cover very small distance with a very big motion, right? Versus he's using that smaller distance with a smaller motion, he's going to hit me. Now, if we're a little bit further distance, that's not as big of a problem, but we'll be talking about that when we go over fencing ear proportion, which will be maybe the next video I'll do. We'll see. Probably not, but coming up soon. So, time relative to distance. What is the pocket? The pocket is when you break the Krieg's rule. Okay, you're either kind of. You bend it. Let's go with that. You're either attacking, defending, or not in the Krieg. If you're in the pocket, what's happening is you have chosen either intentionally or you have forgotten to leave, and you are continuing to have this back and forth in the Krieg. So normally, if I approach or my opponent approaches and we step into the Krieg and I have the advantage, my opponent should seek, if he is not able to counter, he should be seeking to get an offline angle with his withdrawal and then come back into it. It kind of leads to this sort of in and out, sort of rubber bandy type fighting. But, best defense, no be there. So withdraw if you are losing. The pocket is when you both choose to stay there, right? Now, the pocket is something you will see quite a bit in competitional fencing for HEMA, which is both people's feet will stop moving entirely, and they usually end up in what's called a bogan fight, where they're both just parrying over their heads and then cutting back down, parrying over their heads and cutting back down. If you are in the pocket, you are relying entirely upon your speed and getting the covers usually just right. Who's going to lose in the pocket is going to be the slower fencer or the fencer who just messes up. And at that point, you're running on chance. I generally advocate you not go to the pocket and certainly not stay in the pocket for very long. There are times where I will risk it. Even me as a very cautious fencer, I will stay in the pocket every once in a while if I know I can get away with it. That kind of comes into using the Vor in less easy to pin down ways. But anyway, it's not always a good idea, however, because if he's that little bit faster, if you just don't guard quite as well as you should have, if his cut angle's a little different, boom, you're hit. So that's what the pocket is. You have no time to do anything in the pocket. So generally, you can flirt with being around in the Krieg with your footwork because you can attack, you can defend with movement. But if you're in the pocket, usually that's when your feet stop moving because you're purely reliant on speed, and the fastest thing that you can move is your hands. So, quick recap. Out of distance, I can do whatever I want. Out of distance is the time that I should be listening to external things, right? Making observations about my opponent in general. So, my opponent tall? Is my opponent short? What kind of gear are they wearing? What sort of length of sword are they using? Do they favor anything out here? Generalizations. Zufechten. Here's where I flirt with figuring out what my opponent likes. Okay, popping in and out of distance here. Okay. Zufechten is I've started to form my plan. I'm moving through it. My next action is going to take me into the Krieg, where I am either hitting, defending from being hit, or I should not be here. I'm in the pocket. You never want to stay in the pocket probably more than 3 moves. Okay. In general, you never want to stay in the Krieg for more than 3 moves, right? So attack, parry, riposte, defense, maybe riposte. That's about as far as you want to go. Because, again, that starts to bring you into pocket territory, and then you're reliant on speed. So, 1, 2, maybe 3, then get out. So that's just a general sort of overview of the distances. and how they relate to your behaviors. So, I know at the moment it seems very janky, very kind of disconnected. At least I hope it's a little less so. But once you start thinking about these sort of things and putting them together in your mind, all of this is going to make a lot more sense. So, anyway, though, that is a general overview of the distances, and we'll be going over some other techniques and ideas another time.